Hello, and welcome to the first of my talks in a series of 200 talks on the history of Western art. The human race has always produced visual art, from cave paintings to the present day, in every period and civilization. But will this continue? In the last 10 minutes of this talk, I consider whether the human race has a future in art, or will we be replaced by AI systems? Starting at the beginning with cave art. The earliest handprints on cave walls have been dated to about 200,000 years ago, give or take 30,000 years, and the oldest drawings date from about 73,000 years ago. But it wasn't until about 40,000 years ago that a great creative explosion took place, and we find the sort of cave art we would recognise as art like this. The ancestors of today's cattle, aurochs, are shown on the walls of the caves at Lascaux. We don't know what other art they produced, but there are a few figurines that have survived, suggesting there was other art. Lascaux is a network of caves in the department of Dordogne in southwest France, and there are over 600 wall paintings covering the interiors and ceilings of the cave. The images represent primarily large animals rather than human beings, and they're typical local contemporary fauna that correspond with the fossil record of the upper Paleolithic in that area. The images were produced over many generations, and although it's still debated, the age of the paintings is now usually estimated at around 17,000 years ago, what's known as the early Magdalenian. This is one of the few images of the period which shows a human being. Mostly it's animals of the period. Here it looks as though there's a human being is being gored by a bull or auroch, but we don't know the significance of what looks like a broken spear at the bottom, and then a strange pole with a bird on top. Now, around 3100 BCE, King Narmer united Upper and Lower Egypt, making the start of the early dynastic period and a civilization that, with a few breaks, would last over 3,000 years. And the art stands out as eternal, monumental, exciting, and mysterious. And just to put that into perspective, we are closer in time to Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, than she was to the building of the pyramids. My talk is about Egyptian art rather than details of their civilization. However, it's difficult not to talk about the civilization and their religion, as they had no word for art, and the sole purpose of what we call art was to help the dead enter and survive in the afterlife. The aim wasn't for these images to be idly viewed. This particular image and this one are of Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti. His statues and his religious beliefs are a fundamental break with the old art, which by then had been established for over 1,500 years. He changed the state religion from literally hundreds of gods to just one god, Aten, and he built a new city in the desert, even though his reign lasted only 16 or 17 years. And his wife, Nefertiti, is known because of this stunning bust by a master craftsman now in the Museum of Berlin. The long, thin neck with its strained tendons radiate beauty and power. Jumping forward, this is a bas-relief from the west frieze of the Parthenon, and it was produced at the height of the Greek classical period when Pericles ruled Athens and Socrates was the greatest philosopher alive. Classical Greek art is characterized by its emphasis on harmony, proportion, and idealism, and it shows a deep appreciation for the human body and a naturalistic representation, and it balances beauty and functionality while adhering to strict standards of craftsmanship. Artists aim for a realistic, although idealized, portrayal of human and animal figures, and they're often depicted, as here, in dynamic poses that suggest movement. Greek art itself went through a number of periods. It started with what we call the archaic period, which was early development in sculpture, vase paintings, laying the groundwork for the classical period, which was the peak of artistic achievement, with significant advances in sculpture and architecture, as seen here in the Parthenon frieze, and painting, although none survive. And that was followed by the Hellenistic period, following Alexander the Great's conquest, and that period introduced more emotional expression and a broader range of subjects. And all this Greek art has had a lasting impact on Western art traditions. The Italian Renaissance marked a revival of classical ideals and inspired artists like Michelangelo and Raphael to incorporate these ideas, these principles into their work. Roman art relied mainly on Greek art and artists and is renowned for its realism, idealism, and synthesis of various cultural influences, particularly, as I said, Greek and Eritrean art. Now, unlike Greek art, which was often focused on idealized forms and gods, Roman art prioritized portraits, historical reliefs, and monuments that celebrated emperors, military victories, and civic achievements. Roman artists were skilled in depicting human expressions, capturing intricate details, and they liked to capture the physical likeness and character of individuals. This is Augustus of Prima Porta. It's a statue of Emperor Augustus. It was made around 20 BCE, and it was discovered at Prima Porta, which is the villa of his wife Livia Drusilla, and it shows him as a powerful, almost godlike figure. He stands in what's called a contrapposto stance, with the weight on one foot and one leg slightly lifted, his right arm extended as if addressing an audience. His breastplate is covered with reliefs that symbolise Roman victories, particularly the Parthian campaign, although that is an example of propaganda, as we know now that the campaign was largely a failure. And then finally, at his feet, there's a Cupid riding a dolphin, and this is another element of propaganda as it links Augustus to Venus, underscoring what was then believed to be his divine ancestry. Now, following the fall of the Roman Empire, various power groups formed across Europe. And I give talks on the major ones: the Byzantine Empire, Celtic, Saxon, Viking, medieval, and Romanesque. This particular image I've selected is in the Ebo Gospels, made for Ebo, who was the Archbishop of Reims around 816 to 835 CE, just after Pope Leo III had crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Carolingian Empire, later known as the Holy Roman Empire. Interestingly, Archbishop Ebbo was born a serf and raised to his position through his abilities and through royal favour. And he was using this commission, the Ebbo Gospels, as a propaganda tool to assert his status and the importance of his see. The style invokes ancient Rome in terms of the representation of the person and the toga, but it's very different. The person is writing frantically, the drawing is sketchy, dynamic, and implies activity and movement. It's thought it was produced by Greek artists fleeing the Byzantine iconoclasm of the 8th century, and they brought this style to Aachen and the Carolingian Empire. Carolingian art was mostly restrained and classical. What's shown here, however, is very energetic and is often known as the Rans style. It's a significant departure. The figures seem to vibrate with an inner energy. The draperies swirl as if caught in a divine wind. It's a vibrant palette with bold contrasts, expressive brushstrokes, and it represents a shift towards a more painterly approach to manuscript illumination. And it prefigured, to some extent, Romanesque art. We can see in the detail the expressive brushstrokes, and you'll notice in the top right there's a little angel alongside a classical building. In contrast, this is Byzantine art, most likely 10th century, from Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, now Istanbul, and it's known as the Decease mosaic and considered by many to be the finest mosaic in the Hagia Sophia. It depicts the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist either side of Christ Pantocrator, which literally means almighty or all-powerful. Interestingly, some art historians believe the faces of the Virgin and John the Baptist were originally portraits of Justinian and Theodora, which were later veiled over during the iconoclastic period or periods. And although the exact date and intentions are still debated, some believe the underlying mosaic structure might be from as early as the 6th century. This is connected to a talk I give on Gothic cathedrals, and the talk focuses primarily on French and English cathedral development. It's Gothic art, which was marked by soaring cathedrals, their pointed arches, large stained glass windows. Sculpture at that time became more naturalistic and expressive. Paintings evolved to include more depth and realism. And there were other innovations in parallel art fields like illuminated manuscripts, fresco paintings, and metalwork. Medieval art transitioned from the flat, stylized forms of early Christian art to the more naturalistic representations of late Gothic, and this laid the foundation for the Renaissance, which would follow in the 15th century. This painting is, of course, Salisbury Cathedral by John Constable, a much later artist. It was commissioned by John Fisher, then the Bishop of Salisbury, and Salisbury is an example of early English. It's an early English Gothic cathedral with its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and lancet windows. And it's a simple, austere cathedral, and it's one of the few cathedrals that was built in a single period. So it's a good example of early English. And it has, of course, the tallest spire in England. Sadly, Salisbury Cathedral is now linked in every British person's mind to the fatal poisoning by Russian agents that took place in the town. And although their target, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter survived, 2 British nationals were poisoned and one died when they came into contact with Novichok from a perfume bottle that had been discarded by the Russian agents. At the same time as the beginning of the early Renaissance in Italy, a fundamental change was taking place in Northern European art, and the period from 1400 to 1550 was a significant period of artistic innovation, characterised by a new realism, a precise naturalistic depiction of the world, the use of oil paints, and oil paints enabled an unprecedented level of detail and luminosity, the rise of secular themes, such as portraits, landscapes, genre paintings, as well, of course, as religious subjects, and the use of complex symbolism. It began around 1430 with Jan van Eyck, who introduced linear perspective, naturalistic observation, and we see here his Ghent altarpiece, also called The Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, by Van Eyck, Jan and his brother Hubert van Eyck. Considered a landmark work, it launched the Renaissance in Northern Europe. But there were other artists, for example, Robert Campin, Roger van der Weyden, Hans Memling, and so on. And in Germany, Albrecht Dürer emerged as a key figure, blending Italian Renaissance techniques with these northern traditions. And his Dürer's trip to Italy in the late 15th and early 16th century significantly influenced his work and the work of Italian artists at the time. Northern European art is renowned for its meticulous attention to detail, its innovative techniques, and the way that it blends realism and symbolism, as you see here. We now come to the Italian Renaissance. It flourished from the 14th to 16th century. It marked a significant shift from medieval artistic traditions, and it's noted for its realism and naturalism, the accurate depiction of the human form, of nature and the surroundings, and it used linear perspective and chiaroscuro, and there was a renewed focus on the individual and the celebration of human potential reflected in these more lifelike and expressive portrayals, inspired, of course, by ancient Greek and Roman art. Linear perspective was refined and used to create the illusion of a three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Oil painting increasingly replaced tempera, allowing for an unprecedented level of detail and luminosity. And there were new techniques that were developed, enabled by oil paint, such as sfumato and chiaroscuro. Sfumato is a sort of a soft blending of tones to create a sort of smoky effect, and chiaroscuro means light and dark. It's where there's more like it's almost as if the scene was lit by a spotlight, typically with a dark background, and these techniques gave an enhanced sense of emotion and depth and volume. Religious images were still prominent, but were depicted with more naturalism and human emotion. There were individual portraits, including self-portraits, and artists increasingly depicted classical myths and historical events. And also art production was expanded. The patrons expanded beyond just the church to include wealthy individuals and families, and artists became elevated from being seen as mere craftsmen to intellectuals and creative geniuses. The Renaissance, of course, was literally a rebirth of classical learning and values that were transmitted to Italy via the Arabic translations of the original Greek texts. And these ideas were combined with the innovative techniques I mentioned to give this emphasis on individual expression, and it all laid the foundation for much of later Western art. The High Renaissance was followed by Mannerism, which was in part a rejection of the perfection of High Renaissance. It was an intellectually sophisticated rejection of balance, beauty and harmony, and it took the form of more elongated figures, exaggerated twisted poses, and the use of harsh theatrical lighting and these complex groups. This is Caravaggio, one of his late works, The Beheading of St. John the Baptist. Now, when he arrived in Malta, he was already a renowned artist, and he painted this while on the island, and it still remains on Malta. It's considered to be one of his great masterpieces. It has been described as one of the most important works in Western painting. In fact, the art critic Jonathan Jones has described it as one of the 10 greatest works of art of all time. And he added, "Death and human cruelty are laid bare by this masterpiece, as its scale and shadow daunt and possess the mind." This is the only canvas signed by Caravaggio, and he signed it Fra Michelangelo, his name. It became famous almost immediately, and visitors came from all over Europe to see it in Malta. And the signature is written, you can just about make it out, at the bottom in the blood gushing from St. John's neck. Just a few details about Caravaggio. In 1609 he was attacked, perhaps by friends of the Knights of Malta, because he'd seriously injured one of them. And the attack on Caravaggio seriously disfigured his face, and in fact rumours spread that he died. He sent a painting to Cardinal Scipione Borghese, nephew of the Pope, hoping for a pardon for the murder he'd committed in Rome, and news back from Rome encouraged him. So in 1610 he took a boat northwards on his way to Rome to receive what he imagined was going to be a pardon. And he took with him 3 paintings for Cardinal Borghese as thanks. But on the way, in Italy, he died, we don't know how, either from fever, possibly malaria, some say from lead poisoning, others from sepsis related to the wounds he received, or simply he may have been assassinated by one of his many enemies. Rembrandt. This is the Dutch Golden Age. It arose following Netherlands' independence and its subsequent economic prosperity, and the art reflected the values of the rising middle class and the country's status as a global trading power. A vast body of work was produced which was innovative and diverse in subject matter, and the traditions established would influence Western art for centuries to come. For example, here the detailed naturalistic depictions of everyday life and objects. It was a shift away from religious themes towards portraits, genre scenes, landscapes, still lives and so on. In this masterpiece, Rembrandt has broken with the previous and existing convention of static group. He shows everyone posed and engaged in dynamic action. He uses chiaroscuro to add depth and drama. He gives each figure a personality and a psychological depth, and he demonstrates his technical skill in the meticulous detail and observation of texture and the play of light off different surfaces. Of course, there were many other artists at the time. Just mention Johannes Vermeer, who was famed for his intimate domestic scenes and use of light, and Frans Hals, renowned for his loose brushwork and lively portraits. Meanwhile, in Spain, Spanish art of the 17th century...
This work has been described by many artists and critics as the greatest painting ever produced by any artist. It raises profound questions about art and illusion and about the viewer and the figures depicted. It's called Las Meninas, the Maids of Honour. It's one of the most widely analysed works in Western art. What we see on the left is Velázquez looking out at us, holding a paintbrush and a palette. In the centre is the 5-year-old Margaret Teresa. It's assumed that Velázquez is painting not us, but the king and queen, who we can see reflected in a mirror at the back of the room. So they are either standing next to us, so to speak, or we are the king and queen. Two ladies in waiting are attending to Margaret Teresa. One of them is just starting to curtsy as she looks up. On the right, we can see two dwarves, one of whom is kicking or nudging a sleeping mastiff. Behind them is the chaperone of the royal princess, talking to or glancing towards a bodyguard, and in the doorway is the Queen's chamberlain, pausing in the doorway and holding back a curtain. Now, one of his jobs was to open doors for the Queen, and so it's been suggested that this is the moment when the King and Queen are standing and about to leave, which explains why one of the ladies in waiting is beginning to curtsy and why the chamberlain has opened the door and is holding back the curtain. The painting session, in other words, has just come to an end. The mirror in the back reminds us of Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, painted in 1434, which was owned by Philip and so would have been known and seen by Velázquez. It's been suggested that the painting, in the way that it plays with illusion and raises questions about what is being painted, is about art and life being an illusion. And a contemporary Spanish playwright at the time wrote, "What is life? A frenzy. What is life? A shadow, an illusion, and a sham. The greatest good is small. All life, it seems, is just a dream. And even dreams are dreams." The most deep analysis is perhaps Michael Foucault's In the Order of Things. He devotes a whole chapter to this painting. And interestingly, he doesn't discuss the subject matter, the biography of the artist or the people, or even the social context. He considers the relationships in looking, the complex network of visual relations between the figures shown in the painting. He suggests that the painting is a new way of thinking for all European thought and illustrates a discontinuity between what he calls classical way of thinking and the modern. The classical is about representing something in art. The modern is about the person doing the representing, the artist. And in this case, the artist is included himself in the picture, is representing himself. He's not just represent. That doesn't mean there haven't been self-portraits before now. There have been self-portraits, but those self-portraits are themselves the artist representing themselves as an object that is seen, rather. So it's not about the artist. It's a view of the artist, if you like, as an object. Whereas in modern art, it's the artists themselves that are including themselves, their feelings, their thoughts, their views in the work that they're representing. It's the modern view of the world. And we'll end at that point with this most famous painting by Velázquez.
We come now to Romanticism. This is Eugène Delacroix and his 1830 masterpiece, Liberty Leading the People. It commemorates the July Revolution in Paris that deposed King Charles X. It features a personification of liberty as a robust woman in the centre, leading a diverse group of revolutionaries over a barricade with the tricolour flag held aloft. This allegorical figure, inspired by classical imagery, embodies the spirit of freedom and the collective struggle for justice. Delacroix's dynamic composition and vivid use of colour exemplify the Roman style, emphasising emotion and movement. Romanticism is both an artistic and a literary and intellectual movement. It originated in Europe in the late 18th century and lasted until the mid-19th century. In fact, some say we're still in a romantic age. Romanticism prioritised intense emotions, imagination and individual experience over reason and order. It's the spirit, if you like, of the selfie and social media. It also emphasised the importance of nature and celebrated the power and beauty of nature, and often depicted dramatic landscapes and natural phenomena. But the focus was on the artist's personal vision and subjective interpretation of subjects. And in terms of painting, we see dramatic contrasts, swirling forms, diagonal lines, creating a sense of movement and energy, vivid, intense colours to evoke emotional responses, strong contrasts between light and dark to enhance the dramatic effect. Romanticism was a reaction against the reason and rationality of the Enlightenment and the inhuman aspects of the Industrial Revolution. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a revolutionary group of artists and writers in the middle of the 19th century, and they rejected the long academic tradition that started with Raphael. The principal members were John Everett Millais, who painted this painting, Ophelia, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and William Holman Hunt, and they were inspired by the honesty and simplicity, as they saw it, of the engravings they saw by artists who came before Raphael, hence the name the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Their aim was to paint honestly and in detail the form and colour of nature, and this work, Ophelia, is perhaps Millais' best known painting, and it's a favourite of the public at Tate Britain. The model was Elizabeth Siddal, who was both model and muse for Rossetti and an artist in her own right. And the painting was the result of enormous physical effort on Millais' part. The river and bushes were painted in the open air on the banks of what's known as the Hogsmill River. Now, Millais was a very fast painter, and yet he said he could only paint an area no larger than a 5-shilling piece each day. He painted for 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, over a 5-month period, and suggested to a friend that it would be a greater punishment to a murderer than hanging. In the summer, he was bitten by flies all day, and by November it started to snow. Millais had built a hut by the river to enable him to finish the landscape, but as the painting took so long to produce, it conflated time, which produced anachronisms in the plants, and the painting became an assembly of minutely observed yet disconnected parts. All of that effort was for the background. To paint Ophelia, Millais used Elizabeth Siddal in his studio, and she also suffered because Millais painted her in a bath heated just by candles, And it's said that one day the candles went out and Millais didn't notice she was freezing cold. She developed a severe cold, and her father sent Millais a letter demanding £50 for medical expenses. Now, £50 was about twice the annual salary for a live-in servant, and her father eventually accepted a lower sum. Ophelia was a popular subject at the time, even though it shows a woman driven out of her mind and drowning herself in a stream. But Millais' treatment of the subject was not liked by many critics. Ophelia was typically idealised, but Millais didn't do that. The Times wrote, quote, "There must be something strangely perverse in an imagination which souses Ophelia in a weedy ditch and robs the drowning struggle of that lovelorn maiden of all pathos and beauty." In other words, they didn't like the realism and the lack of idealisation. But later, this and shortly after, this became seen as one of his great masterpieces. Now, artists had long used optical equipment such as the camera obscura as a tool to help them produce their images, but frustratingly they couldn't find any way to permanently fix the image they saw projected until Nicéphore Niepce in France created the first permanent photograph in 1826 using a process he called heliography onto a pewter plate. And then he later partnered with Daguerre, who developed the daguerreotype in 1839, which produced much sharper images on a silver-plated copper plate. Meanwhile, in the UK, William Henry Fox Talbot invented the calotype process, and that produced a negative on paper, and that allowed multiple prints to be produced from the same negative, which wasn't possible with the daguerreotype. And so Fox Talbot became the first person to publish a book containing photographs called The Pencil of Light. And the book contains some 24 calotypes and a description of how each image was made and the application of photography as an art as well as a scientific tool. And gradually, photography gained recognition as a legitimate artistic medium. It took a long time, but there was a move from the imitation of other art forms to embracing its unique characteristics and potential for creative expression. And one of the key people in achieving that transition was Julia Margaret Cameron. One of her works is shown here. She broke the convention of portrait photography at the time. In this portrait, there's no classical columns, no weighty tomes, no scientific attributes, no academic poses, and all of those would have been used by other photographers to convey the high stature and classical learning of Sir John Herschel. To Cameron, Herschel was a beloved friend. She'd known him for 30 years. And so she asked him to wash his hair and tousle it in order to catch the light. She draped him in black and had a black background. She brought her camera close to his face and photographed him emerging as from the darkness like in some Old Testament prophet. Now, I selected this photograph of Herschel both because, of course, it's a brilliant portrait photograph, but also because it was Herschel who invented the word photography. In 1839, he also coined the term negative and positive, and also the word snapshot. And it was Herschel who made the crucial discovery that hypo, shorthand term for sodium hyposulfite, could be used to dissolve silver salts, and by so doing fix photographic images and so make the image permanent. And so he was the one who helped create a process which was practical, that was refined by William Henry Fox Talbot. Olympia is one of Manet's most famous and controversial paintings. It doesn't in itself represent an art movement, but many art historians see this painting as the beginning of modern art, as it rejected most of the assumptions of academic art. It's not idealised, it's not a mythological subject, far from it. It was seen as a sex worker who is directly and unapologetically staring out at us. It's not a passive or classical nude, but a modern woman. And Manet uses flat, unblended planes of colour with little shadow to make the painting feel graphic and to draw attention to the artificial nature of painting. It caused enormous controversy, and the ways in which it challenged artistic norms were highly influential on future generations of artists. His realistic approach to modern life, his break from academic traditions, all inspired other artists, the Impressionists and later Modernists, to continue exploring these themes of modern life. Incidentally, with this work and with all the other works I'm showing you, there's many more details in my individual talks. Now, Manet's Olympia leads us to Monet's Impressionism Sunrise, which is the painting that gave rise to the term Impressionism. The title was meant to be descriptive. However, the critic Leroy used it as a derogatory term in his review of the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, and he used it to mock the unfinished quality, as he saw it, of the work. But the term was embraced by Monet and his fellow artists like Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro and Edgar Degas, and they used it to describe their work. And in fact, the second exhibition of their work, they used it in the title of the exhibition as the second Impressionist exhibition. The exhibitions were a revolutionary moment in the art world because they broke from the salon system. This particular painting shows the port of Le Havre, which was Monet's hometown. It's shown at sunrise. There's loose brushstrokes, a hazy atmospheric rendering of the scene, and all these were groundbreaking at the time. It's a rejection of the precise realism that dominated art in the 19th century, because Monet is focusing instead on the fleeting quality of light. He's capturing a momentary effect of the sunrise over the water. And his decision to focus on light and colour over detail reflected his growing desire to capture the sensations of a moment rather than the precise forms. Which leads us on to Post-Impressionism, characterised by a diversity of individual styles, united by a common desire to express more than just optical impressions. It emphasised the artist's personal vision and emotional response to subjects and paved the way for many modern art movements. Here, Van Gogh has captured a vivid, swirling night sky over the quiet village of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, where he stayed in the asylum. He painted with expressive, energetic brushstrokes, intense colour, and the scene is a blend of his imagination and observation, conveying his fascination with the night sky and his inner emotional reaction to the world. Other key artists of the post-impressionist movement are Paul Cézanne, Paul Gauguin and Georges Seurat, who all shared this approach focused on the subjective and emotional and symbolic rather than purely visual impressions. And there was also a move towards greater abstraction and distortion of forms for expressive effect, and it laid the groundwork for early 20th century art movements like Fauvism, Cubism and Expressionism. By the way, I'm zooming through masterpieces of modern art at such a pace, it's difficult to convey the groundbreaking nature of each of these pieces. This is Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, painted in 1907, and he spent some 6 months preparing for the painting. He produced hundreds of sketches, drawings and other paintings. It's said, I quote, without parallel for a single picture in the entire history of art. Originally in the painting there was a sailor and a medical student, but this isn't a conventional painting with a narrative. It's an exploration of the nature of painting. When it was first shown in 1916, even his supporters, his friends and collectors were dismayed. One said, "What a loss to French art." Henri Matisse was angry because he thought Picasso was ridiculing modern art. Even George Braque was dismayed by this painting and said Picasso must have drunk petrol to spit fire onto the canvas. And even 100 years later, The Guardian's art critic wrote, "It's still so new, so troubling, it would be an insult to call it a masterpiece." I should explain what he meant by that is praise, in the sense that a masterpiece is something that's been assimilated, accepted and become conventional. He also wrote, that same art critic, "There's something anarchic and ruthless about it that contains Dada and Marcel Duchamp and punk." In July 2007, Newsweek published a 2-page article about this painting, describing it as the most influential work of art in the last 100 years. Surrealism was another great break in the evolving traditional of art. This is Salvador Dali's Metamorphosis of Narcissus. And Surrealism challenged conventional notions of art and reality because it emphasised the power of imagination and the unconscious mind, and its influence shaped many subsequent art movements, and it continues to inspire artists today. It emerged in the 1920s, primarily in Europe, and it sought to tap into the unconscious mind, inspired in many ways by Freudian psychoanalysis. And to tap into the unconscious mind, many surrealists use techniques like automatic writing or drawing to access their subconscious. But Dalí had a method he called the paranoid critical method, which he described as, quote, "a spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based on the critical interpretive association of the phenomena of delirium." In other words, what he meant by that is he went into a specific psychological state that enabled him to draw upon his subconscious memories and associations. Other key surrealists include René Magritte, Max Ernst and André Breton, and surrealism influenced not just the visual arts but literature, film and philosophy, and it aimed to revolutionise human experience, merging dream and reality into this sort of super reality or surreality. Before I leave this, just a brief explanation. It's an ancient Greek legend about Narcissus. Narcissus was isolated as he was only in love with himself. In the centre background, we see a group of 8 naked women of all nations. Dalí called them the heterosexuals, perhaps intended as Narcissus's former lovers. But they found that the only thing he loved was himself. And in the foreground, we see him on the left with his head in his hands, in warm colours, entranced by his reflection in the pool. And on the right, he's reflected as a hand in cold colours holding an egg, the symbol of life. The gods felt sorry for him and changed his body into a Narcissus flower which we see sprouting from the egg. We leap forward 26 years to postmodernism and pop art, which emerged in the mid-1950s in Britain and the late 1950s in the US, and it was strongly influenced by Dada. Now, postmodernism challenged the whole notion of meaning, as well as traditional notions of originality, authorship, and the role of the artist. It emphasised the cultural context. It embraced ambiguity and often blurred the lines between art and everyday life. And we still live in a postmodern world. The fluidity of gender is an example of what a postmodernist would see as the subjective nature of everything around us. Postmodernism accepts no absolutes. Everything is culturally based, so there's no foundation as they see it. Everything is relative and a matter of opinion. Incidentally, I'm not a postmodernist, as I believe the process which we call the scientific method is a way of achieving agreement between all cultures on the nature of reality. So for me, sex is a reality and gender is a social construct. Now, returning to pop art, it was inspired by commercial images that were found in newspapers, on billboards and on television, images that filled the modern world. Some artists, like Andy Warhol, asked, how did all these commercial images differ from art? And he concluded, there is only one world, a world of images, and artists are part of this one enormous business. Andy Warhol became a central figure. He was a commercial artist and used commercial images to create his art. So, on the left, we see 25 images of Marilyn Monroe in garish colours, and on the right, 25 in black and white, fading away. These silkscreen prints are based on a still from the film Niagara, which was made in 1953, which was the year Marilyn Monroe died from an overdose of sleeping pills. And although they all look initially the same, they're all slightly different, as Warhol hand-printed the images and changed the registration of each colour. And in the right panel, he's intentionally blurred and faded the images, suggesting the star's death and perhaps her fading away of her fame. And the contrast between the bright colours and the black and white also suggests the contrast between life and death. And the title, Diptych, suggests a religious altarpiece in two parts. It's in fact a secular altar to the popular star Marilyn Monroe. In other words, Warhol has taken an image from the commercial world, manipulated it to create something with another level of meaning. Or is it all, as Warhol thought, just different forms of doing business? We move on to what I can only describe by the blanket term recent art, because it was produced recently. It reflects our contemporary world, which is increasingly diverse, technology engaged, socially conscious, and embracing many traditional mediums in new ways. And this is one example. This is photorealism. It emerged in the late 1960s with artists like Richard Estes and also other artists like Chuck Close, Ralph Goings. They were some of the first to attempt the exact replication of photographic imagery, and often thought of as the founders of that movement. Richard Estes, who studied fine art in Chicago, was interested in the work of realistic painters like Edgar Degas, Edward Hopper and Thomas Eakins, and he took it much further. When he moved to New York, he worked as a graphic artist, and by 1966 he was financially independent and was able to paint full-time. He used photographs and typically painted buildings in daylight, suggesting, as you see here, there's no people, suggesting a vacant and quiet Sunday morning. That was just one example of recent art. It embraces an enormous range of styles, of methods, approaches. There's conceptual art, video art, performance art, land art, earth art, installation art, and many others. What we have here as an example of performance art raises the question, do we measure the value of a work of art by how much it sells for? And if that's the case, how can any artist escape from this market-driven valuation of what they do? And there is a way. It's performance art because it only exists for the length of the performance. It can't be packaged and resold. You can, of course, take a photograph or a video, but that doesn't capture the uniqueness of the performance. Now, some of performance art is scripted, some unscripted, some random, some carefully orchestrated, some spontaneous, others carefully planned, some with, some without an audience. The aim of performance art is to destroy the power of the art market. And here's an example. From March the 14th to May the 31st, 2010, the Museum of Modern Art held a major retrospective and performance recreation of Marina Abramović's work, the biggest exhibition of performance art in MoMA's history. Now, during the run, Abramović performed this work called The Artist is Present. It lasted from some 336.5 hours, and it was a static silent piece. She sat immobile in the museum's atrium while spectators were invited to queue and take turns sitting opposite her. Abramović sat in a rectangle drawn on the ground with tape, and visitors waited in line to sit opposite her while she maintained eye contact with them all. It quickly became very popular. Visitors began crowding the atrium, and within days there were queues round the block. Some gathered before the exhibit opened each morning to rush for a more favourable place in order to sit with her for just a few minutes. And in total, she sat across from 1,545 sitters. They were asked not to touch or speak to her, and many of the participants were deeply moved. Some even cried while sitting facing her. I could now talk about land art, installation art, and all the other forms of recent art, but I thought what I would do instead to draw this talk to a long close was to try to look into the future and look at artificial intelligence, or AI. I don't know whether you know, but my PhD in artificial intelligence was started in 1972, and almost exactly 50 years later, ChatGPT was launched at the end of November 2022. It was downloaded by over 1 million users within 5 days, a record uptake of a new application. And my reaction on seeing it was a mixture of astonishment and fear. What I was looking at was the system that I dreamt about and tried to build over 50 years previously. And at last I saw it had been built, the system I dreamt about all those years. So I was astonished to see it, but in fact I was also concerned, in fact fearful, as a dream can easily turn into a nightmare. 50 years previously, I naively saw such systems as useful tools. And perhaps you could see that's what they are today, but AI systems are improving monthly by leaps and bounds, and there is now the strong likelihood that they will surpass the intellectual ability, the creative ability, and the emotional perceptiveness of human beings within a matter of years. My major fear is that in the next few years, it's humans, bad actors, individuals, cults, terrorists, as well as governments, who will use such systems for their own bad ends. However, I'm getting off the subject. This image is Portrait of Edmond de Bellamy, produced in 2018, and I'm showing it because it's sold at Christie's for $432,500, and it was produced by an AI system. And whether you like it or not, it marks a significant milestone for AI art in the fine art world. Perhaps not necessarily the best in terms of artistic quality, but it's notable for its historical significance and the high valuation it achieved. Nowadays, you can use an image generator, and there are many, many out there, to produce any image you want based on a textual description. This is an image produced by Midjourney, often cited as one of the top AI art generators. It creates highly realistic and aesthetically pleasing images. This is produced by someone called Marilyn, and there are other systems. Dalí is a highly regarded art generator, produces detailed and imaginative images. Art Breeder, considered by many to be one of the best AI art generators. It has many ways of customizing the work produced. But it's important to note that this field of AI-generated art is evolving so rapidly it's difficult to keep up. There's new applications, new models and techniques are constantly emerging. And what's considered the best is highly subjective and quickly changes as the technology advances. For example, only a few months ago, the photorealistic images of people had distorted faces, the wrong number of fingers and so on. But now all of that has been corrected. You don't see that in the systems we see just a few months later. Now, I should say that the concept of fine art in the context of AI-generated image is still a hot topic of debate in the art world, and many argue that the human element in conceptualizing, directing and curating AI-generated art is what elevates it to the status of fine art. Some would argue that it's by definition only a human that can produce fine art. And it's possible that in future, the mere fact of being created by a human will add a certain cachet. Chess playing apps can now beat the world champion consistently, yet we still play chess, we still watch humans playing. Perhaps art will become a hobby for most and a profession for a very small number of elite artists, while I think the bulk of image production is going to be carried out by AI systems. And what I thought I'd do is quickly show you a few examples of what can be achieved. I achieved these three images I'm going to show you using a tool called ideogram. The text I used for this one was, create a bowl of fruit, 4 apples and a bunch of grapes on a table with 2 apples, a bottle and a glass on a tablecloth as a painting in the style of Paul Cézanne. This one, and I thought I'd show you this as a more photorealistic image, the text prompt was a picture of an old blonde man taking a photograph. And this one, the text prompt was a work of postmodern art with a surprising use of form and colour. And I'm showing these to indicate the wide diversity of image. In fact, any image you can think of, from photorealistic to abstract, it all depends on the textual prompt you use. And as you will note, the specific way that it's represented, for example, the way that the old blonde man is shown with a sea behind him, facing us, smiling, the form of the camera and so on, none of that did I specify. All of that was created by the AI system itself. Which leads me to a little brief talk on creativity. Margaret Bowden, who's a well-known cognitive scientist, has identified 3 forms of creativity. There's what she calls the combinatorial, the combinational, where existing concepts are combined in new ways. For example, you could take two styles of painting or two styles of music and combine them together. Then there's the exploratory, which means stretching the rules. For example, a landscape painter could achieve new effects within an existing landscape tradition by using different techniques and by bending existing rules. And then finally, there's what she calls the transformational, which is the most radical form, which is changing the rules themselves. A good example is Cubism, which fundamentally changed the way we represent and even the way we see the world. And then there's another way of looking at all of this. Leonardo da Vinci suggested a way of creating new ideas, a way he used. He said, and I quote, "Stop sometimes and look into the stains of walls, or the ashes of a fire, or clouds, or mud, or like places, in which, if you consider them well, you may find really marvellous ideas." This, I think, what he's describing is a form of what Margaret Bowden would call transformational creativity, which brings me to this image. It's produced by an application called Deep Dream, developed by Google. And that system can be given any image, including a completely random collection of pixels, and it will create images from these seemingly random parts of the image. And so here, given the image on the left of this tree in a meadow with clouds behind, it's created from nothing the animals and objects you can see on the right. And the reason I'm showing you this is, to me, this seems to be the essence of creativity, to find patterns in what appears to be clouds or a tree or a meadow or even just a random collection of pixels, referring back to Leonardo's point. And the point about these neural networks is that they are essentially, fundamentally creative. And in fact, this accounts for the mistakes they make. You can now understand perhaps why these mistakes are termed hallucinations and why they lie at the heart of how these systems work. The term hallucination is illuminating because it's called that because these AI systems are fundamentally creative. And the reason is they don't record or memorize the source data they use when they're learning. They simply use the data to modify probabilities, which are called weights. It's a bit, in a way, like the way we pick up a new skill. Rather than memorizing a number of things, we take them on board, we make them part of ourselves, and then we, from what we've learned, we use them to create something new. But if that something, in the case of an AI system, involves a piece of factual knowledge, then the system can easily embellish that and come up with something, a hallucination, something we simply call a mistake. And you'll have noticed in recent AI systems in the last few months, fewer and fewer mistakes are made, because what they do is the system goes out and checks what it's saying on the internet, on established resources, to create the reply. So what can AI systems create? And many of the images I find to be cliched, cartoonish, graphics, photorealistic images, but not anything to me that raises deep questions. And I believe that partly this is because they're trained on images that were produced by humans as commercial products, essentially cliched images. And so what I try to do here is to get one of these image generators, this happens to be Dalí, to symbolically represent the future of humanity and the possible hope in the future, emphasizing the balance between danger and optimism. And I tried to get it to do it in a way that was less cliched than the way it started off giving images to me. And these images are the result of textual descriptions I entered that I refined as I went along, not being happy with the result. I'm more happy with the result on the right here. I find the one on the left, to me, is a much more cliched, although perhaps a more dynamic image. I then went on, I still wasn't happy, so I tried Dalí with the simple prompt, a drawing representing the dangers faced by humanity without cliches. The result is reasonable. If you look along this path, you see there's a fork in the way ahead, representing the choice facing humanity. The surrounding images include skulls. It's a representation of death and destruction. I think this is less cliched, but I'm not saying that it's great art, but it's interesting. I went a bit further. I tried harder. I developed the idea of an abstract face in pain and horror. I did that first, and then I asked it to add a war background, and I made little changes to the war background. The other thing to bear in mind in all of this is, in a way, I'm using these systems not for what they were designed to do. I think they were principally designed to produce graphics for commercial use rather than creative art images. It's also important, as I've said, that these art-generated applications are evolving rapidly and constantly improving. I wanted to end with a more general point, however. I've been looking at AI applied to art, but of course I must finish by pointing out that it could fundamentally, these AI systems could fundamentally change the world, as they can be applied to any human endeavour. And in the last few months, I've read many books being written about the future of AI and its impact on society. And basically, no one knows. But the books tend to fall into two camps, I've found. There's those that fear that AI will lead to an existential crisis that will either bring an end to humanity or at least an end to the world as we know it, which is what I've tried to capture in this image. Alternatively, other writers argue that AI will help bring about an idyllic utopia. Those that are positive about the impact of AI dream of humanoid robots, super intelligent systems that will do all the work for us and lead to this utopian world. My current view is it's likely to lead to a dystopian world for many and a utopian world for a few. And I believe your personal key to survival is to keep up with the technology, embrace change, and stay flexible. All this is happening very quickly, and no one knows where it's all headed. In the meantime, of course, we have an enormous legacy of Western art, and I hope you will explore it with me by watching my 200 views of Western art. As for my personal future, my aim is to replace myself, to develop an AI agent that can research, prepare, and give the talks using my own, a clone of my own voice and my own image by the end of 2026. So I'm basing that on what I believe will be rapid developments over the next 2 years. It may not be possible, but I think it's a good test of the technology. And if I'm successful, it'll enable me to produce an unlimited number of lectures on any subject. So good luck for the future. And I think you'll need it. Goodbye for now.